Hey guys, tonight we follow Dionysus, god of wine chaos, and regrettable life choices as he wakes up from yet another divine bender. You know the feeling, the throbbing temples, the dry mouth that tastes like a satyr's sandal. The vague memory of turning a river into Merlot, just to see what would happen. Except for Dionysus, this isn't a one-time mistake. It's a lifestyle. And the worst part, some fool served him chilled wine last night, and his immortal taste buds are still recoiling in horror. You shuffle through the wreckage of last night's symposium shattered amphorae, a snoozing panther, and at least 3 nymphs braiding each other's hair in a corner. The air smells like fermented grapes and poor decisions. Dionysus groans, reaching for the nearest wineskin, because, of course, the cure is more wine. But here's the thing, you probably wouldn't survive a single night in his entourage. Between the lethal drinking games and the occasional mortal-turned-dolphin incident, it's a miracle anyone made it to sunrise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Is it 2 a.m. in Tokyo high noon in Arizona? Dionysus doesn't care about time zones, but I'm curious. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Dionysus wasn't always the poster child for responsible consumption. Born twice long-story exiled as a baby drama, and raised by nymphs who definitely didn't have parenting licenses, he had opinions about wine. Mainly, it should be room temperature or else. Historians still argue whether his preference was about flavor or just divine stubbornness. But one thing's clear, ancient Greeks took their wine seriously. They diluted it with water. Amateurs debated its medicinal properties. It cured everything, obviously, and wrote poems about it like it was a lover. And here's a quirky tidbit. Dionysus's aversion to cold wine might have been practical. Ancient Greeks didn't have ice unless they hauled it down from mountains, and even then, chilling wine was a hassle. Why bother when the Mediterranean sun did the job for you? Plus, cold masks flavors, and Dionysus was a connoisseur. He could detect notes of oak myrrh and regret in every sip. So, as you slump deeper into your pillow, imagine Dionysus draped in leopard print, squinting at a servant who dared bring him a frosty goblet. This, he mutters, is an act of war. The first sip is always the worst. Dionysus glares at the offending goblet as condensation drips down its sides, an abomination in his eyes. You know that moment when you take a drink expecting one thing and get another. Imagine that times 1,000 with the added bonus of being an immortal deity capable of smiting mortals for culinary crimes. His nose wrinkles. Who iced the wine? He-Boom's voice, still hoarse from last night's rendition of the Ballad of the Drunk Centaur. A terrified satyr scuttles forward, hooves clattering. My lord, the humans in Macedon swear by chilled. Dionysus doesn't let him finish. With a snap, the goblet's contents heat to precisely 68° for our metric friends. The ideal temperature for detecting notes of fig rebellion and bad life choices. The satyr sighs in relief until Dionysus mutters, "You're on grape-stomping duty for a month. Here's a mainstream fact. Ancient Greeks believed temperature altered wine's essence. Cold numbed its spirit, while warmth revealed its truth for better or worse. Dionysus, ever the drama king, took this personally. A quirky tidbit, his followers claimed he could taste the mood of the vineyard workers who harvested the grapes. A happy harvest meant bright floral notes. A grumpy one added a hint of existential dread. Historians still argue whether Dionysus's preference was divine discernment or petty spite. Some scrolls suggest he once cursed a Theban noble to only speak in rhyming couplets for serving Chianti too cold. Others say he just hated the brain freeze sensation. Either way, the message was clear: room temp or face the consequences. As you drift deeper, picture Dionysus swirling his warmed wine, side-eyeing a mortal who dares reach for an ice cube. Don't, he purrs. Just don't. You ever notice how everything just tastes better when you're lounging in the perfect climate? Dionysus certainly did. As the midday Mediterranean sun bakes the marble floors of his villa, he sprawls across a chaise, fanning himself with a grapevine, while servants wave palm fronds overhead. This is why room temperature wine isn't just a preference, it's survival. Here's the thing about ancient Greece: their summers could melt the wax off a philosopher's beard. Ice was a luxury hauled down from Mount Olympus by overworked satyrs, who definitely unionized in secret. Chilling wine required elaborate underground cellars, or amphorae, dunked in wells, and Dionysus wasn't about to wait that long for his next drink. Life's too short, he'd slur, even though his life was literally eternal. A mainstream historical nugget. The average summer temp in Athens hovered around 90 degrees. Now imagine drinking an ice-cold Retsina. In that heat, your teeth would shatter before you tasted the pine resin. But here's the quirky bit: Dionysus's vineyards actually thrived in the heat. The hotter the summer, the sweeter the grapes, and the higher the alcohol content. Some scholars suggest his miraculous vintages were just grapes left to ferment in the sun until they could double as paint thinner. Historians still argue whether Dionysus preferred warm wine because it got you drunk faster. Scrolls from Delphi mention a two-goblet rule for visitors anymore, and you'd start seeing centaurs in the tapestries. As you sink deeper into your pillow picture, our wine god lazily toasting the sun as his latest batch practically boils in its jar. Perfection, he murmurs, while somewhere below a mortal tries and fails to chill their wine without divine intervention. The vineyard slopes stretch endlessly under the afternoon sun, as Dionysus surveys this year's crop with a mix of pride and existential dread. Harvest season is here again, which means hordes of hungover satyrs stumbling through the rows, mortal workers complaining about wages paid in wine, and at least one nymph dramatically fainting from heat stroke. You'd think being the god of viticulture would be glamorous, but right now it's mostly paperwork and sunburn. Dionysus plucks a plump grape, rolling it between his fingers before popping it into his mouth. The burst of sweetness carries whispers of volcanic soil and last Tuesday's rainfall, because of course his palate is pretentiously precise. A nearby satyr nervously offers a tasting sample from a new batch. One sip, and Dionysus's eyes narrow. tastes like myrtle berries and poor life choices, he declares. The satyr wilts. Here's a mainstream fact. Ancient Greek vineyards trained vines up trees in sprawling canopies, creating shaded walkways perfect for drunken philosophizing. But here's the quirky tidbit Dionysus won't admit: half his divine vintages were happy accidents. That time, a lightning strike charred an entire crop, aged beautifully. The batch that fermented near a sulfur spring unexpectedly popular with the underworld crowd. Historians still argue whether Dionysus actually improved wine or just took credit for nature's work. As you imagine the sticky sweet chaos of harvest season, notice how the god's sandals crunch stray grapes with every step. Each squish sounds like a mortal's hopes of ever impressing him. The real challenge wasn't growing the grapes, it was finding enough poor souls willing to harvest them. You'd think working for the god of wine would be a dream job, but the reality involved dodging territorial wasps' sticky sap that glued your fingers together, and Dionysus's habit of quality testing the crop every 15 minutes. A satyr named Melos wipes sweat from his brow, his hooves sinking slightly into the sun-baked earth. He's been picking since dawn, and his back feels like it's been trampled by a herd of maenads. Nearby, a mortal worker named Theron mutters darkly about how his contract promised generous wine rations, but failed to mention the 14-hour shifts. Here's a mainstream fact. Vineyard labor in ancient Greece was backbreaking, often done by enslaved workers or indentured servants. But here's the quirky twist: Dionysus's vineyards had a bizarre turnover rate. Nymphs kept quitting to pursue poetry. Satyrs faked injuries to get out of work. And one particularly clever mortal escaped by convincing everyone he'd been turned into a grapevine. Dionysus found this hilarious and let him go. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was a terrible boss or just blissfully unaware of mortal limitations. Scrolls from the era show increasingly desperate help-wanted inscriptions, seeking strong backs and weak wills. Wine provided, but you'll need it. As you drift deeper, picture Melos, the satyr, squinting at the horizon, calculating how fast he could run if he ditched his basket right now. Somewhere in the distance, Dionysus cheerfully calls for another tasting session. Theron sighs and reaches for the nearest wineskin. It's going to be a long afternoon. The real magic happened after dark, when the harvested grapes were carried to the shadowy recesses of Dionysus's legendary wine cellars. You'd expect a god's storage facility to be all gleaming marble and golden casks. But no, his preferred aging room was a damp cave behind a waterfall where the air smelled like wet stone and poor decisions. Dionysus runs his fingers along a row of clay amphorae, each sealed with beeswax and marked with cryptic notes like Batch Natartamar 42, do not open until the solstice unless really bored. A nervous satyr follows with a tablet recording which vintages get stored where. The ones destined for Olympus go on the left. Those are the polite, well-behaved wines that won't embarrass him in front of the other gods. The experimental batches, like the one aged with pomegranate and bad ideas, get shoved in the back. Here's a mainstream fact. Ancient Greeks stored wine in buried amphorae to maintain steady temperatures. But here's the quirky twist: Dionysus insisted his best vintages needed to listen to the waterfall's rhythm to properly mature. scholars found cellar inscriptions reading, "This side faces north for wines that need to contemplate their life choices." Historians still argue whether Dionysus was a storage genius or just making up rules as he went along. As you imagine the echoing drip of water in the cave, notice how the god pauses before a particularly dusty amphora. "Ah, 342 BC, he murmurs. That was a good year for bad decisions. Of course, mortals kept getting it wrong. No matter how many times Dionysus preached the gospel of room-temperature wine, some upstart noble would inevitably serve it chilled just to be innovative. You can picture the scene a stuffy symposium in Corinth, where a wealthy merchant proudly unveils an amphora packed with snow from Mount Parnassus. The guests murmur in admiration until Dionysus, lounging invisibly among them, lets out an audible groan. The god materializes just enough to knock over the offending vessel. "Barbarians," he mutters as the red stain spreads across the mosaic floor. The merchant turns pale, suddenly remembering that time Dionysus turned a whole banquet hall into snails for serving watered-down vintage. Here's a mainstream fact. Greeks believed mixing wine with snow was a Persian affectation, and therefore morally suspect. But here's the quirky tidbit. Dionysus had a special curse reserved for ice enthusiasts. Their wine would always taste slightly of wet goat, no matter the vintage. Archaeologists found a complaining merchant's tablet that reads, "3 shipments ruined, that God has no chill," in the most literal sense. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was protecting tradition or just being a petty connoisseur. As you imagine, the panicked symposium guests, pretending not to notice the floating wine god in their midst, consider this maybe some deities just want to watch the world learn proper drinking etiquette. The satyrs had reached their breaking point. After centuries of being Dionysus's personal sommeliers, cupbearers, and occasional crash test dummies for questionable new vintages, they'd finally had enough. You know that moment when service industry workers snap imagine that, but with hooves and unchecked divine wrath. The rebellion began quietly, a missing amphora here, a mysteriously watered-down batch there. Then came the manifesto scrawled in wine lees on the wall of the cellar. No more 3 a.m. tastings. Pay us in gold, not exposure. Dionysus stared at the message for a full minute, before taking a thoughtful sip and declaring, "This vintage has notes of labor unrest." Here's a mainstream fact. Ancient Greece saw some of history's first recorded strikes, including a famous one by pottery workers. But here's the quirky twist. The satyr's list of demands included hazard pay for Maenad-related incidents and a clause about not being used as footstools during divine naps. Historians still argue whether Dionysus respected the strike or just found it entertaining. Scrolls describe him negotiating while lounging on a floating grape cluster, alternately threatening to turn them into cork trees and promising better snacks. As you drift deeper, picture the lead satyr negotiator nervously adjusting his wreath, realizing too late that no one brought actual talking points to a divine labor dispute. Warfare in the ancient world was brutal, but Dionysus had his own unique approach to battlefield strategy. If you can't beat them, get them catastrophically drunk. Picture the scene. A Persian army camped along the banks of the Euphrates, unaware that their water supply now contained enough Dionysian vintage to floor a minotaur. By midnight, soldiers were serenading their helmets, trying to negotiate peace treaties with campfires, and in one memorable case attempting to ride a very confused goat into battle. Dionysus watched from a nearby hilltop, swirling his room temperature, obviously wine with satisfaction. Artemis has her arrows, he mused. I have my 342 BC reserve. Here's a mainstream fact. Greeks sometimes spiked enemy provisions, but here's the quirky twist. Dionysus insisted his vintage warfare was more humane. His personal rules of engagement. No poisoning that's gauche, just enough alcohol to make the enemy question their life choices. Historians found Persian scrolls complaining about the grape-based ambushes that left entire battalions hungover for days. Historians still argue whether this counted as chemical warfare or performance art. As you imagine the morning-after groans of 1,000 Persian soldiers, notice how Dionysus's panther yawns lazily. Even the big cat knows no one wins in a drinking contest against a god. The symposium was in full swing when the philosophers started arguing again about whether warm wine actually improved intellectual debate or just made everyone think they were profound. Dionysus, draped across a couch like a disheveled leopard, watched with amusement as Plato's students slurred. But if the wine is always room temperature, how can we trust our perceptions? A nearby poet hiccuped in agreement. This was the god's favorite mortal pastime, watching great minds tie themselves in knots while mildly intoxicated. He'd seen it all, stoics crying over love poems, cynics finally admitting they wanted hugs, and at least one mathematician who became convinced his cup was a four-dimensional object. Here's a mainstream fact. Greek symposia were equal parts drinking party and intellectual salon. But here's the quirky tidbit. Dionysus kept a private scroll ranking philosophers by how entertaining they became when tipsy. Socrates annoyingly stayed coherent far too long. Historians still argue whether Dionysus encouraged these debates to spur genius or just for the schadenfreude. As you imagine the hazy lamplight and the smell of spilled wine, notice how the god subtly refills the most pompous scholar's cup. Some experiments need repetition. Every deity has their secret recipe, and Dionysus guarded his like a dragon hoarding gold, if dragons were prone to drunkenly giving away clues during emotional moments. The truth, his divine vintage contained one unexpected ingredient: seawater. Just a splash per amphora, harvested from a specific cove near Naxos, where the waves allegedly whispered to the grapes. You'd think this would result in a disgustingly salty wine, but somehow, through divine intervention or fantastic luck, it created a briny crispness that made drinkers recall their first love and or questionable beachside decisions. Dionysus would never admit the secret, of course. When asked, he'd gesture vaguely and mutter about ambrosia runoff, or the tears of Maenads. Here's a mainstream fact. Greeks sometimes used seawater in cooking, but here's the quirky twist. Dionysus claimed the salt balanced the wine's soul. Scrolls from Delos describe nervous merchants trying to replicate the taste, resulting in batches that alternately tasted like regret or a fish's revenge. Historians still argue whether the seawater thing was genius or just Dionysus messing with mortals. As you imagine, the god carefully measuring his secret ingredient. Notice how his panther sneezes at the smell. Some trade secrets are best kept. The morning after a Dionysian feast was its own special kind of mythology. Mortals would wake up clutching their heads desperately, trying to piece together fragmented memories. Had they really arm-wrestled a satyr? Why was there a laurel wreath tied around their left ankle? And most pressingly, what was in that last cup Dionysus handed them, the god's infamous hangover cures, were predictably just more wine but medicinal wine, or so he claimed. His personal favorite was a thick honeyed concoction he called Nectar of the Regretful, served in a cup engraved with helpful reminders like, "You said you'd never do this again," and "The sun is your enemy now." Here's a mainstream fact. Ancient Greeks used herbal infusions to combat hangovers, but here's the quirky twist. Dionysus insisted his method worked because the hair of the dog that bit you should be an entire divine wolf. Archaeologists found amphorae labeled hangover batch, containing traces of honey myrrh and what might have been dissolved aspirin, or possibly just crushed pearls for drama. Historians still argue whether Dionysus actually believed in his cures or just enjoyed watching mortals suffer through placebo effects. As you imagine some poor Athenian groaning into a golden basin, notice how the god cheerfully offers them another drink this time with an encouraging pat on the back that nearly knocks them over. Mortal vintners tried for centuries to replicate Dionysus's perfect room temperature vintage. They built special cellars, consulted oracles, even begged the god's disgruntled former satyr employees for hints, all to no avail. The closest attempt came from a Cretan winemaker, who aged his batch near volcanic vents, resulting in a wine that tasted like the earth's fiery core, in a bad way. Dionysus took this imitation game as both flattery and personal challenge. When particularly arrogant vintners claimed to have perfected his methods, he'd arrange for their next shipment to mysteriously transform into vinegar, or, in one memorable case, very confused tadpoles. Here's a mainstream fact. Greek wine competitions were fiercely competitive, but here's the quirky tidbit: Dionysus occasionally entered anonymously just to crush mortal egos. One judge's notes survive. Entry Maurinoeven. Perfect balance, haunting finish left me questioning my life's work. Probably divine interference. Historians still argue whether Dionysus protected his legacy or just hated sharing the spotlight. As you imagine a deflated vintner staring at his failed batch, notice how the breeze carries the faint sound of divine laughter from somewhere behind the olive trees. The eternal party wasn't so much a location as a state of being a shimmering, wine-soaked limbo where time blurred, and the serving temperature was always perfect. Here, Dionysus held a court amidst floating couches and self-refilling amphorae, welcoming everyone from tired heroes to accidentally deified mortals who'd wandered in during a particularly wild festival. You'd think eternity would get boring, but the god kept things fresh with creative drinking games. Pin the tail on the Minotaur. Philosophical debates that devolved into nap sessions and the occasional guest appearance from other gods, except Hestia, who found the whole scene tacky. Here's a mainstream fact. Greeks believed in Elysium. But here's the quirky twist Dionysus's party realm operated on: God Standard Time, where what felt like an hour could be a century in the mortal world. Some scholars believe several missing historical figures just got stuck at a really good after-party. Historians still argue whether this was an actual dimension or just collective wishful thinking. As you imagine the endless twilight and the distant sound of lyres, notice how even the stars seem to sway slightly, though that might just be the wine. The last glass is always the sweetest. Dionysus lounges on his celestial couch watching the party wind down as mortal listeners drift toward sleep. His panther curls at his feet, empty goblets float in lazy circles, and somewhere in the distance a satyr snores into a lyre. The god sighs contentedly, swirling the final dregs of his favorite vintage, still always the perfect temperature. He knows tomorrow will bring new vineyards to bless new mortals, to gently torment with drinking challenges, new rebellions to quell with strategic snack distributions. But for now is for stillness. As the stars dim above his eternal party, Dionysus offers one last toast to the dreamers, the revelers, and everyone who ever preferred their wine properly served. The amphorae begin to hum a lullaby of forgotten harvest songs, blending with the sighing wind until even the god's eyelids grow heavy. And so we leave Dionysus there half dozing in his world of perpetual twilight, where the wine never sours and the hangovers never come. His story lingers like the aftertaste of a fine vintage, fading slowly sweetly, carrying you toward sleep on its current. The night has grown quiet around you now. Perhaps a breeze stirs the curtains, or a distant car hums along some unseen road. These small sounds only deepen the stillness like ripples that prove the pond exists. Let your breath match the rhythm of that imagined vineyard, inhaling the scent of sun-warmed grapes, exhaling all remaining tension. Dionysus's world recedes, but its peace remains settling over you like the gentlest of vines. The stars, the sheets your slowing heartbeat, all part of nature's perfect room temperature balance. Sleep comes not as an ending, but as the next toast in an eternal symposium. And when you wake well, there will always be more wine.